welcome to the What If We Think Differently podcast. This is our philanthropy series, and this is episode 3. My name is Nontsikelelo Nzula, and I am joined by Tendai.
Hey, how are you?
I am doing okay.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. There'll be no podcast without you today. So we are discussing philanthropy. In our first episode, we spoke about the definition around African philanthropy. In the second one, we unpacked the evolution or the growth of African philanthropy. And in this episode, we are going to take a look at the differences between African philanthropy and global philanthropy.
Sure.
All right, so over to you, Tendai. What is the difference between those two?
There are many differences, but also many similarities. Like I said, when you're talking about African philanthropy, you have to look at it through its 3 broad manifestations. I mentioned this in the first episode. The philanthropy that is done by high net worth individuals and the corporates that they establish that are mostly African and giving resources within Africa and to the world. So that's one aspect. Does that facet of philanthropy look different or look the same with global actors, those who are maybe their colleagues, who are also engaged in the same, because these are titans of industry. These are people who have made money from their entrepreneurial activities? No, it doesn't. It's quite the same. It's quite the same across the globe. They become rich, they give of a surplus. I think the only nuance different is that the majority of the African high net worth philanthropists are not beneficiaries of the tax deductible status that we see in the global north. So that's sort of what it looks like in that layer of high net worth philanthropy, corporate philanthropy, etc. In the second layer, around intermediaries, the intermediary formation or institutional framework is actually quite common. It's a huge organization that sort of aggregates, mobilizes resources from different sources to give to a certain cause, a thematic area. Is that unique to Africa? No. In fact, prior to what we're calling intermediaries entered the space, we already had INGOs, international NGOs, that were already behaving like these intermediaries. Because in many instances, when you talk to colleagues in the NGO space and you say, can you name a donor? Some of them will mention INGOs, Oxfam, Save the Children, CARE, because they've been subgranted through that. So INGOs have always served maybe a dual role. On the one hand, they're direct implementers of projects, but on the other hand, they also subgrant from big grants. So again, that's a global phenomenon that's part of best practice or exceptional practice in this space. Then the third layer, is there a difference between what communities in Africa do and what we see in the global north? I think there are 2 things that we have to look at. The first one is that the real difference is that the majority of our people in Africa are still rural, while the global north is highly urbanized. But does it mean there are no communities? No, there are communities. So they have established across North America. You'll be surprised by what you see. Community foundations. They are in small towns, they're in neighborhoods, etc., etc. And they do exactly what we've been talking about. They help in mobilizing resources from many to help a community. But the difference is when we begin to look at how we appropriate cultural facets into our work. So that's one major difference, and I've already talked about it. But another one is just the understanding around the larger framing of African philanthropy. Because when you now go to African philanthropy as a way of life, African philanthropy is not an after effect. Because when you look at what high net worth individuals do globally, even here in Africa, it's let me get rich first. Then I'll give away the surplus. But when we talk about African philanthropy as a paradigm or a way of life, we start off with African philanthropy. The values, the mechanisms, and the principles are the ones that define how we are organized as a community, how we actually appropriate value, how we actually utilize productive assets. We are using a paradigm that we're calling African philanthropy. So I always say to others, philanthropy is an end product in certain societies. For us, philanthropy is something that we do from the beginning. Right. So it influences everything. It influences production, distribution, accumulation, and welfare.
All right. So in the previous episode, we spoke about the modernization of African philanthropy, and now we're looking at it from the aspect of global versus African philanthropy. From my understanding, of which I stand to be corrected by you, it seems to me that African philanthropy is community-based, like individuals putting together things. And I know you spoke about, community foundations and how they bring their resources together. But what does African philanthropy look like within institutions? And when I say institutions, I'm talking about organizations with legal standing registered. So for me, it seems like global philanthropy is your foundations, the big guys, the big guns that are giving money to Africa. But in terms of African philanthropy, how does that translate?
So let me start off by and this may sound controversial, but African philanthropy is at its infancy in terms of developing, in the language you are using, institutionalizing, formalizing itself. So African philanthropy then has some level of a dependency. We always work around the the analogy that was developed by Jerry Salo around what you call a scaffold. That when you're looking at how you build a structure, a house, an office structure, whatever, around it, so that the builders can reach higher levels, they need a scaffold. So we look at global philanthropy as that scaffold that is helping us to build our house that we call African philanthropy. So if you look at that, then you begin to realize that there's that level of dependence, but there's also because we're using the term scaffold, there's also an understanding that this dependence is temporary. At some point, we'll kick away the scaffold. Yeah? My fear, and I'm writing about this, that we have held on to the scaffold too much, that we've become so comfortable with having our house surrounded by a scaffold. We have not come to a place of maturity. So we have to begin to ask ourselves, for how long do we need the scaffold? And when do we remove the scaffold? When does the practice, the thinking, and the institutions of African philanthropy become mature to stand by themselves? Right. And I must concede that we're not where we were. Over 20 years, we've seen a lot of progress being made in this sector. Institutions have come up. Some institutions have actually long-term reserves. Institutions have come up and codified practices. Institutions have earned global recognition coming out of Africa. So it's very important to celebrate what we have achieved, but also acknowledging that there's still a long way to go.
Right. So talking about that, when we look at the way African philanthropy addresses issues within communities and the way global organizations address issues in the same communities, are there any differences between the two?
Oh yeah, big time. Because we always speak of this. So this is we're part of a global village, and we assume that there is a linear way of dealing with the problems. Because we're in a global village, there are countries that we say are developed, others are not developed. So when we're looking at the problem of underdeveloped countries, is to say, how do we make them to look like us? Us meaning those who are in developed countries. So we are caught in this trap of modernization. And in the process, we then think that there's only one path of development, which becomes very problematic when you're talking about even African philanthropy itself. So when you're thinking from that perspective, you now have to pause and say, what then do we really want when we're talking about African philanthropy? Is African philanthropy trying to mimic a certain development path, or is African philanthropy trying to forge a different path of development? So the consensus is what has to be developed and sort of approved or receive widespread support within the ecosystem of African philanthropy, so that we can begin to have conversations with our colleagues who are in global philanthropy institutions. Because if you look at what I call the intermediary layer within the philanthropy ecosystem in Africa, it was established as a response to say, we need to engage global foundations on how they are framing and naming the problems of underdevelopment and how they are fashioning responses. So the challenge was recognized way back to say, we are not going to go far if we're allowing only external actors to define what the problem is. Right. So the idea was always to say, let's create capable institutions that are not only capable in terms of moving money or mobilizing money, but are also capable in terms of a counter narrative. So for us, the development of the African philanthropy space has never been about, oh, we need more foundations. Yes, we do. But it has also been about, we need academics. We need people who think and reflect on this. We need our own philosophers to begin to say, when we're talking about philanthropy in Africa, it should ideally look like this. These are its challenges. Because no one can come and tell you in your home to say, your problem is this. You live, so you need to get a chance to say, what is the problem you face? That's the challenge we've always faced in Africa, to say no one asks us the important questions. They come with the answers ready. But we are hoping that the development and maturity of the African philanthropy space, its first responsibility is to help shape the response, is to help shape the engagement, the quality of engagement between ourselves as Africans and also those who are outside.
Okay, so another question that I have, you spoke about defining our trajectory as African philanthropy. Can that be done outside the scope of development as a whole for Africa? Or do we first need to define what our development looks like as Africans, and then we can come and talk about philanthropy and what it's supposed to look like?
Yeah, okay. So I don't think, somebody was saying that we're talking about and this is totally unrelated, but I want to bring it back. We're talking about the Zimbabwean crisis, and somebody was saying, no, we need to fix this first. Then I said, so we're going to wait and do nothing until this problem is fixed. So I think it's the challenge with linearity. Just thinking in a linear fashion to say, this needs to be done first, this. Because I think then that will mean we need many starts. Yeah, maybe we've been engaged in a false start. But what I believe is coming to a place of what you may call an alchemy, when all things come together. When conversations begin to happen within the philanthropy space itself. Because those three actors I made reference to are also hardly in conversation with each other. The high net worth,
silos.
They are working in silos. So there's that work that needs to be done to say, you are part of a bigger umbrella that we are calling African philanthropy. You need to have certain conversations that are helping you learn, are helping you foster collaboration amongst yourselves. But that's one. But then you've got also another space of people that we may call that are at the call phase of development. The colleagues who are engaged in implementing projects, who are working in communities, etc. They're also not having a conversation with this philanthropy space. Then communities themselves, the supposed beneficiaries of this layer of service level NGOs, are not having conversations with these service level NGOs. They're not having conversations with philanthropy. So we are having a lot of silo-based conversations before we go to the global north amongst ourselves. So Africa is yet to understand that there's no silver bullet. There is no one who's best positioned to fix Africa's problems, except we begin to understand that it will take all of us. All of our institutions, all of our universities, all of our NGOs, all of our think tanks, all of our community foundations. So we are trying to make sure that there's that collaborative understanding towards fashioning solutions. So that's the real challenge that we face. Because the challenge is, in the absence of a unified approach, which is what you're talking about, then Africa is open to everyone, because they don't come to talk to every African. They talk to whomever it's so convenient. And normally they use the challenge of resource dependency. So if global philanthropy organizations come to NGO X that is already struggling with resources, NGO X is not going to say, no, we're not going to accept your money because of these values, etc. They will take it because there's resource scarcity. So I think, and I'm not saying we should push back on resources, but I'm saying that if we make sure that there is a consensus, things like, we take for granted things like the African Union's Agenda 2063. But if we all coalesced around a vision and we begin to say, how do we all contribute? This is your question. How do we contribute as the philanthropy space, as NGOs, as think tanks? How do we contribute to this? Then when we're now talking of resources, we're talking from a position of the understanding of our role and responsibility within that ecosystem.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's look at the differences in terms of sources and strategies that African philanthropy and global philanthropy use. Are there differences in those as well, or we're kind of just using the same strategies, using the same resources, but allocating them differently?
Yeah. So even the definition. So people say, oh, when you talk about African philanthropy, we're talking about resources that are mobilized from within or from Africans in the diaspora. We're expanding it. then everything else, maybe let's call it philanthropy in Africa. Because if you use the sourcing of resources, you immediately kick out the intermediaries. Because the intermediary layer, mostly 95% of the times, the resources that they are also re-granting are coming from external sources. They're coming from outside of Africa. They're coming maybe from global foundations, from ODA institutions, etc. So I think the understanding, and this is a slightly controversial, is around saying the use.
The use. Is that what defines philanthropy?
No.
African philanthropy?
No, because if you use
the
use and also maybe purpose,
okay,
and also maybe the institution that has been given responsibility over resources. I'm tinkering on the edge because it's easy to dismiss others to say, because you are using international resources, therefore you are not an African philanthropy support organization or whatever. And the majority of us, like I said, the scaffolding, if you remember the scaffolding.
Yes, I remember.
If you remember, so the scaffolding by its very nature means that the majority of us are depending on resources from outside. But the challenge is to say, till when? So what we're beginning to ask in conversations amongst practitioners and thinkers is to say, what strategies are we putting in place to make sure that we can kick away the scaffold, but the building remains intact? That's the huge issue, because I think the scaffold has become a crutch. We've become so used to the scaffold. Now we fight a lot about, the scaffold is bent. They didn't give us strong material for the scaffold. You know what I'm saying? So all those issues around shift the power, localization, all we're talking about is the scaffold. Because these are not our resources. They're resources coming from elsewhere. But if you really come to our platforms and listen to our conversations, my fear is that we're spending more time focusing on the scaffold rather than focusing on how we build our own house.
Right.
And to the extent to which you can actually build our house using borrowed resources or foreign resources. Again, there was another conversation where Graça Marcel talked about the issue around you cannot fill your granary with things that have come from others. You have to fill your storehouse with what you've produced. Yeah? So I think that's the challenge, to say, to what extent are African philanthropy organizations seized with the question of mobilizing African resources? Because African resources, we hear they are there, but they are not easy to mobilize. Yeah? They don't come with an RFP, a request for proposals. They do not come with donors that we know and what they want. Yeah? So either you are doing individual giving, or you are going to a high net worth individual who has set up a foundation, but the same foundation is also engaged in implementing. So African resources are not yet formalized for ease of access. Yeah? So that's the challenge we face.
Okay. So seeing that we're using the matrix of the distribution of resources to kind of define what African philanthropy is, what are the differences between the distribution of funds? If I'm not getting you right, please correct me at any point. What is the distribution of funds by African philanthropy organizations and global organizations? Is there a difference at all, or we're just like a conduit?
No. The underlying or underpinning philosophy was that African organizations, especially the intermediary layer, I keep on making reference to the intermediary layer because I spent a lot of time within an intermediary organization up to a place of leadership. Our claim when we used to engage with Global North Foundation was that we understood the African continent better, that we could actually come up with a way of better mobilizing and then deploying resources. Yeah? So that was the claim we made. And I think it's a valid claim that intermediaries are mostly manned by Africans. But you know, what has happened, and this is the most strange thing, Global North foundations that work in Africa have also changed tact. In the majority of cases, all Global North foundations are now run by Africans for their offices in Africa. So the claim around understanding the continent better it needs to be nuanced a bit. It needs better framing. Maybe our argument now could be we are better on the ground. We have established an ecosystem that is resilient, etc. So, because like I said, in the majority of cases, if you look at organizations that do genuine re-granting, it's not the high net worth foundations. High net worth foundations, in terms of granting, where they have been strong has been granting in the form of scholarships, the majority of them. But in other instances, they have mostly spent their resources. They actually set up foundations that also implement projects. So in the majority of cases, non-profits spread across Africa rely on global north private foundations that have offices and presence in Africa or just have programs in Africa, and also on intermediaries. So, but intermediaries, even the softwares they use, etc., it's just like what you see in global north foundations. So I think that's the challenge to say, when we're talking about this, is there a real difference at that layer? That's the real issue. I think that's the purpose of this podcast series, because as I'm reflecting, I'm beginning to say, have we missed the whole objective of this African philanthropy space? That's the real issue, because we are behaving just like global north actors, if not worse.
So is your stance that currently there is no difference between global philanthropy and intermediary organizations?
Yeah, look, this is going to be controversial, but anyway, let's go there.
Get into it.
Yeah, so I think in the majority of cases, the disciplining factor is not whether or not you're African or not. The disciplining factor is the compliance. If you're going to receive resources from a global north philanthropy foundation, you have to behave in a certain way. You have to comply with laws in a certain way. So you are just going to, the word I use, and it may offend others, you are finding yourself engaged in mimicking. You have to set up rules around compliance. You have to set up due diligence processes. You have to set up, in the same way, you just end up looking like a global north foundation. So that is the challenge, that intermediaries are failing to come up with a character of their own that is set apart from what we see, because I think this is what we now call global best practice. So given global best practice, it's always a universal or a uniform approach. So that's where we are. But I think there have been experiments. We've seen interesting experiments. I was talking to an organization based in South Africa that is trying to re-grant to smaller organizations using different ways, using a one-page letter as an application. So there are those attempts, but we are not seeing it as widespread practice. So that if there's any reason for us to convene as African philanthropy actors, is to take a look at ourselves and the extent to which we're actually advancing the agenda of disrupting philanthropy in Africa.
All right, so we've concluded, so to speak. You are allowed at any point, as I said, to come and say, no, Nancy, that's not what I'm saying.
Sure.
We've concluded that intermediary organizations then simply at this point, before we remove the scaffolding, are mimicking global philanthropy. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, but it may be construed as just putting all organizations in one basket. There are certain organizations.
One brush, yeah.
Yeah. So there's certain organizations, like there's a foundation in Kenya that has really made huge advances in terms of mobilizing its own reserves, using very interesting approaches. Like
unorthodox measures.
Yeah, but no, look, it's really about building resilience, but also building your own basket of funding, so that when a donor comes, maybe it's a matching mechanism, matching basket. So I think we see that in Kenya, there's a lot of innovation around that, and also in South Africa around that, because I think intermediaries should not limit themselves to just getting huge grants that they then split into small pockets. But intermediaries help to be landscape interpreters. So they convene actors, they facilitate dialogue, they advance certain agendas. And because of their proximity or the way they connect with global practices, then they begin to help to say, there are these global conversations that are taking place, but there are fewer Africans engaged with them. So they begin to facilitate that. But thirdly, they also begin to innovate around how do they mobilize and create their own sustainability pockets. Like I said earlier, the comfort of just writing a proposal and vis-a-vis trying to set up a more elaborate process of mobilizing resources, as a leader, you end up defaulting to what is easier. Yeah. You just write a proposal, you push that and you get resources, then you continue with your work.
Right. So as we kind of conclude this part of our discussion, are there any lessons that can be learned from African philanthropy by global philanthropy?
Oh, okay. I think there's quite a number. And actually think, without them saying, they have learned a lot. So for instance, in the 90s, I don't know where you were, in the 90s or even 80s, Global North foundations, in the majority of cases, would bring foreign nationals from their countries to be directors of their offices across Africa. But that has ended. They've now come to accept that they are capable Africans able to run their regional offices.
Can I throw in a very controversial remark?
Yeah, please.
In there, does the changing of, I don't want to call it office holders, that sounds like government, the changing of, let's say, directors or leaders within those organizations translate to a different culture within those organizations?
Yes, in a very big way. The foundations generally have become more open. Generally, they are more engaged because the people who are going there are not just coming from Norway. Some of them are coming even from African organizations, etc., etc. And the levels of engagement, especially with the foundations that I deal with, are intense. I've seen them receive very brutal feedback, and I've seen them deal with it. It's humbling, but it's necessary when communities come and say, we don't know what you're doing here. I've seen them do that, but over time, I've actually seen that it has helped in a certain way. It's not where we want to be, but I can assure you it's a good start. Right. We're in a better place now because we're now talking to colleagues who understand our challenges, colleagues who understand what it means to run a non-profit in an African context, etc. So that has been a huge benefit. So that's number one. Number two, there's also, I've noticed in my previous experiences, I've noticed that if as Global North foundations are writing their strategies, they've become more aware for the need to consult. Not only to consult their offices, but also to consult partners. We've been engaged on several occasions by different foundations when they are writing their own strategies to say, these are the things we're thinking about, what do you think? So I sense that there is an ongoing opening up. I'm not so sure how evenly distributed it is across foundations, but it's a start and it's great. So I think it's important. But like I said, at times we focus so much more on the scaffold and we're not looking at what we are doing amongst ourselves. So at times, even my writings, I'm accused of this because I rarely talk about the scaffold. I try to look at the practices amongst African philanthropy organizations.
Okay, so from what I got, one of the things that they can learn from us or from African philanthropy is consultation. Yes, and also prior to this, when distance was an issue, they would only fund a very thin layer of maybe top organizations. But now, by being on the continent and also by talking to Africans, they've begun to go and discover interesting organizations. That's number one. I think the huge lesson for me is to say, if they are doing due diligence, they have to understand the challenges with the landscape, the legal field that many Africans have to comply with. But again, I'm seeing Global North foundations taking risks when they are here around certain organizations registered in a certain way, taking risks to work with them. So I think it's this risk taking that is always important if you're going to trust those who are at the coalface of change. Because those organizations may not have sufficient mechanisms, say, of accountability. They may not have a strong board. They may not have an audit trail. But when you begin to see those Global North donors beginning to say, despite this, we're going to give them some grace period to comply. Okay. So we're bringing this to a close. Your closing remarks around philanthropy and globalization and African philanthropy.
Yeah, well, look, you are adding globalization. That's another day's discussion. But anyways, I think the complementarity is very clear, especially at the intermediary level and also at the high net worth level. There was one collaboration that I was tracking, I found fascinating, the collaboration between Bill Gates and Aliko Dangote, the Gates Foundation and the Dangote Foundation, in the campaign to end polio in Nigeria. That was huge, So I found that as interesting. Then I also tracked the collaboration that was fostered by our own Strive CEO of the Higher Life Foundation around the responses to Cyclone Idai, where he began to mobilize his peers or his counterparts, the millionaire and billionaire class. That is not only African but global. So the reason why I'm citing these two is to say we celebrate the emergence of high net worth foundations for the fact that, number one, they shape the discussion in places we can never be, where they are in part of those privileged spaces, number one. But they are now putting money on the table, either to collaborate amongst themselves or to bring in others from outside in a collaborative framework, rather than just to say Africa is a recipient of aid. So we're not there 24 years ago. So this is worth celebrating, and we can begin to see that if this begins to congeal into best practice, we can begin to see better framed initiatives in response to disasters, even the disaster in Liberia around Ebola. We saw high net worth individuals being mobilized by the AU under the chairmanship of President Kagame to say, let's go into Liberia and resolve Ebola as Africans.
Yes.
So that was led by African high net worth individuals. So I think if there's anything is, if there are African high net worth individuals originating from the African village, one thing that they know is the power of collaboration, the power of collective work. So in many instances, we expect them to work in tandem with each other, not in competition. So that will really help push the agenda forward.
Right, thank you so much, Tendai, for that. You have just joined us. Maybe you've never been to our podcast before. This is the What If podcast. What if we think differently? And this is our philanthropy series. And here we were discussing the difference between African philanthropy and global philanthropy. So, Tendai, thank you so much. I think that was a very interesting discussion for me. And I had a lot of preconceptions around African philanthropy, which I think I'm better informed.
Fantastic.
All right, so thank you for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day, possibly morning, evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.